For voters who were so deeply disenchanted, and all of us spoke to voters through the course of that 2024 campaign, deeply disenchanted with the status quo and with Democrats, they didn't necessarily see that democracy as working for them. And if you don't see it as working for you, it's not necessarily one that you're as willing to protect. Hey guys, welcome this week. And you can tell we have a wonderful new face with our podcast this week. So Katrina is on break. Really happy to welcome CBS's congressional correspondent, Caitlin Huey-Burns. How are you?
Great to see you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for joining. And Bernd de Busman, you're actually on holiday in Mexico, but joining us anyway. So I feel like you get extra points this week.
Oh, I appreciate that. I didn't want to miss it. So much going on.
There is a lot going on. And, we'll jump right in because we thought it'd be a good opportunity to take an episode to talk about the Democrats. We have talked in previous podcasts about where the Democrats stand and some of their struggles and messaging and finding the messenger. But, something that really prompted me is I was again in the UK last week. And it's so interesting I was speaking to a few Democrats abroad who were saying, why aren't the Democrats saying anything about the Epstein files? Why aren't the Democrats saying anything about Medicaid cuts? It was fascinating because, the three of us know they are, but clearly it's not cutting through. So, it seems like a good time, right, to just take stock of where things are. What do you make of that, Caitlin?
Yeah, it's really interesting that you say it that way too, because going into this congressional recess, I mentioned congressional recess because that is a time that is kind of designed for lawmakers and politicians to be kind of at home, talking to their constituents, talking to people who, to try to get a sense of their bases of support and to kind of do a pulse check on the country. And heading into that was all they were talking about. It was all Epstein all the time with a side of the big, beautiful bill. So it's interesting that that's the perspective that you were hearing. And, we've been monitoring town halls across the country because that does give us a little bit of a barometer about how people are feeling. And earlier this week, there was a town hall in Nebraska, a state in a district that Trump won overwhelmingly, that the Republican who represents it won overwhelmingly, but Democrats found it as an avenue or a venue, I should say, to voice all of their frustrations going on. And so it was really interesting. He was asked about Epstein, he was asked about immigration. You felt this really intense, palpable anger and angst about some of these issues. And to me, as we're kind of judging that, it's not so much that Republicans are necessarily feeling that way. It's kind of we're looking at some data points to show us how Democrats are feeling and what they are doing about it. And in this instance, it was going to their Republican lawmaker and expressing that anger. In other instances, you're seeing it through different lawmakers and politicians trying to kind of capture that anger, capture that anxiety, and kind of respond to it in different ways. And Democrats found a way to use Epstein to not only needle the administration, but also to try to drive a wedge among Republicans while also revving up their base.
And one thing I found quite telling in the last couple of days, there was a quote from I believe it was Hakeem Jeffries in the New York Times saying that in his view, one strategy for the Dems could be to kind of club the Epstein issue with some of those big beautiful bill issues in that framing both as the Republican Party protecting the rich, which I think is kind of like an
Mm.
eye-opening
Hmm.
way for Democrats to look at that. But I also think it's kind of indicative of them. They didn't really have an opening to kind of market themselves like Republicans have in the past using social media and memes until this Epstein thing came around. And then now you're seeing them kind of playing catch up in that regard in terms of, just how they're reaching some of these voters, Republican, Democrats, undecided or otherwise.
Well, what I found really interesting, to your point about harnessing, kind of corralling that energy among Democrat voters, Caitlin, if you look at the polling, those voters might be energized on some of these issues, but they're not necessarily happy about their party, are they? So I was looking
Yeah.
at this AP NORC poll that was, I think, conducted in July, and it showed that about 50% of Democrats described their own party as weak, apathetic, ineffective, disorganized. Only about 2 in 10 Democrats described their party positively. So that really tells you where people stand, or Democrat voters stand, on seeing their party as a vessel, if you will, for that type of anger.
Yeah, Stewie, I think that is such an interesting and important point, because we're seeing from Democratic voters, they don't like what's happening, but they don't necessarily feel like they have a path forward. And that's in big part because there is no kind of singular Democratic leader at this point. A lot of people are trying to kind of vie for that position, but there's a huge vacuum in leadership. And so you're kind of seeing different ways that people are testing this out. You're seeing it in Texas, which I'm sure we'll talk about with the redistricting and the response to that. You see it on the House and Senate floors, respectively, where lawmakers are taking to the floor to either use their floor time to express this anger and kind of channel it on behalf of their constituents. You're seeing, them trying. Earlier in the year, we saw, Bernie Sanders and AOC going to very Republican areas and holding big events to try to, kind of poke them a little bit, and also kind of show that there is potentially a Democratic base out there for the taking, for the mobilizing. But Democrats have really struggled with being able to exert any sort of real leverage, at least when it comes to lawmaking. I mean, they weren't able to stop the so-called Big Beautiful Bill. They've been able to delay successfully. They've been able to delay some nominees, but they haven't really been able to prevent many of them from going through altogether. And, they're just a minority party right now, and they're trying to figure out ways to use their leverage. And then you have this kind of clash of a base, not necessarily, they're not, that doesn't suffice for them at this point. So we'll see kind of what other techniques they can use to at least communicate to the base, we're here, we're with you, we hear you. But at the same time, I should note that they still have so much work to do in gaining more voters. I mean, they have lost key constituencies over the years, and that was especially acute in the 2024 election. So there's this question of, the more they lean into the base and try to galvanize them, which you need, especially heading into a midterm, are you also alienating some of those voters that you have to gain in order to win presidential elections?
I think that's a really good point. I mean, especially about those voters that, they might not be swayed by the same arguments as, that AOC, for example, is out there espousing. I was recently talking to a few Latino voters who, for the first time, voted Republican last year, and in their view, nothing has changed in terms of Democrats'
Mm,
messaging towards them, speaking to the economic issues that were the reason they voted for Trump in the last election. None of that
yeah.
has really changed. So I think, the Democrats still have a long way to go in terms of figuring out messaging that has kind of broad appeal across, different segments of Democrats or potential Democrats. And very little time to do so. I mean, the midterms really, really aren't that far away.
Yeah, that is an important point for all of us to keep in mind as well, that the midterms are kind of bearing in on us. But, the messaging point is a really interesting one, because I was trying to think of, since January 20th, since President Trump was inaugurated, what are the different types of messages that the Democrats have tried to use? What are the different points where they've really pushed back on? And in looking at some of the issues that they've really tried to attack Donald Trump and the Republicans on, some of them have been more effective, clearly, than others. But, if you look at the democracy argument, in my view, that seems to be one. So the accusation that Donald Trump and his Republican allies are chipping away little by little, or actually, large piece by large piece, as the Democrats would say, at the democratic foundation of this country, and really threatening the entire project that is this American democracy. I'm not so sure that that's an argument that works. I mean, remember that in the 2024 election, that was one that, before President Biden dropped out, that he really made his centerpiece. He did in 2020 as well, and it worked for him. Clearly, his campaign thought it would work for him again before he dropped out. But, for voters who were so deeply disenchanted, and all of us spoke to voters through the course of that 2024 campaign, deeply disenchanted with the status quo and with Democrats, they didn't necessarily see that democracy as working for them. And if you don't see it as working for you, it's not necessarily one that you're as willing to protect. On the other hand, if you look at the arguments, again, coming back to the Epstein files and again, Medicaid cuts, these are things that affect the bottom line and that kind of sense of an elite and a status quo. So perhaps those are the messages that will cut through more. But I don't know. What do you think, Caitlin?
Yeah, it's interesting because I remember over the campaign, a lot of voters and, strategists and operatives telling me, it's one thing to care about democracy, but if you can't pay your bills, it doesn't leave you much room to make that your top priority. And I think, we are still hearing from voters that they're concerned about the economy. Prices are still high. We still have inflation, even though some of the numbers are changing. Obviously, that jobs report, signaled some cause for some concern. There's still a lot of uncertainty about the president's tariff plan. A lot of people just don't know what to make of it yet. So there is still that economic component. But it is interesting, I mean, to your point earlier about how Hakeem Jeffries was trying to thread the needle on Epstein, to a lot of what the president has been doing is promises made, promises kept. And on the Epstein files, it was billed as, I told you I would release these, and I am. And it was a issue of, the MAGA base was the one that said, wait a second, this is not what we asked for. You didn't deliver on this yet. So it's interesting to see whether that tears open a little bit. And I think that's where Democrats are trying to kind of thread the needle a little bit as well and try to widen that wedge if it is there. But I do think the problem still exists of reaching voters for whom the economy is still top of mind. And it is going to take some time to see kind of what this looks like in terms of the president's economic policies. I don't know what kind of conversation we're going to be having a year from now as we're really kind of in the heat of the midterms. But that's also why Democrats wanted to hang on specifically to portions of this big, beautiful bill, particularly cuts to Medicaid, to SNAP, and to other kind of social safety net programs to kind of make that contrast, as they're saying. And then meanwhile, Republicans are trying to pick parts of that bill that they think sell well, which is, according to them, the tax cuts, extension of the Trump tax cuts, new tax cuts like no tax on tips and overtime. So we'll see whether people are feeling any of that this time next year, because that's so much of what this is. It's how are you feeling about it, not necessarily what the numbers tell us.
And I also think there's kind of a growing realization among a lot of Democrats and people working on behalf of the party that some of those arguments about democracy and authoritarianism, they're almost too academic. I mean, they're difficult ones to explain in a simple way. And in the last week alone, I've heard, for example, Cory Booker kind of articulated that. I think he used the word academic himself, and but when you put it in terms of kitchen table issues, the economy, SNAP, Medicaid, those are something that people will really understand without having to get into those more almost bookish in, issues of inflection points in history and fighting against authoritarianism, which I think is kind of a really hard sell to a lot of people.
It is, and I think it is important to note as well that, we talked a bit, or you mentioned, Caitlin, a bit earlier, what has been happening in Texas and with the battle over redistricting there and Democrats walking out amid a special session to prevent the Republicans in Texas from being able to redraw maps so that they can gain more seats in Congress for those midterm elections. You now see Democrats saying, okay, we're going to fight fire with fire. We can redistrict in our states as well, in California and Illinois. I mean, you wonder, and I've talked to a few Texas Democrats on our programs in the past week asking, okay, is this a message that really is resonating with your own constituents? And they say they think it is. Certainly Texas Democrats and Texas Democrat voters are supportive of this move, but it remains to be seen if it will be supported more broadly. But another thing I think is important to note is that partly what is plaguing the Democrats, in my view, is the fact that they haven't necessarily come to an agreement on why they lost the 2024 election still. Were they too left? Were they too right? Were they too moderate? And you see that really in some of the characters. So Zohran Mamdani seen as perhaps this man who can herald this new progressive era. Well, look at the gubernatorial races in Virginia and New Jersey, which are going to take place in November. You have two centrist, fairly moderate Democrat women, national security minded, who are also doing really well. So, I mean, maybe it just can be both.
Yeah, and it is a time, this year that we're able to kind of, as political reporters and analysts, kind of collect all of these data points. And a lot of operatives will tell you, okay, what works in one area doesn't necessarily work in another. The problem for Democrats is because there's such a huge leadership vacuum that a lot of people coming to the forefront are easily exploitable by the other side. So Republicans certainly want to make Mamdani a national figure and kind of paint everybody that's running for office with that broad brush. So you're going to see some Democrats kind of distance themselves from it, focus hyper locally on some of these races. But your point is so important too, about that there hasn't really been a real taking of stock about what went wrong. And I was thinking of Kamala Harris announced this week that she is going to put a book out and tell her side of how everything happened. And I think, that depending on what's in it, whether that reignites a lot of this, angst among the party about what they missed and what went wrong. And also, how to move forward and gain new voters. I think that really hasn't quite been answered yet. And on the redistricting component, this is an example of Democrats using what little leverage that they have when they're in the minority to exert some type of pressure, or at least make a national issue out of it. But the question I had going into it was, doesn't this show how Democrats have been outmaneuvered by Republicans? I mean, for years, Republicans have been very focused at building party infrastructure at the state and local level, building up those state houses. And there's a reason that they are able to do this kind of thing in Texas. And I think now we're seeing, Gavin Newsom and others saying, okay, well, we're going to try to do the same thing in our states. And that just suggests to me that kind of they don't want to unilaterally disarm, but they were essentially outmaneuvered by Republicans on this particular issue. And I hear a lot from Democratic Party voters that they want their Democratic leaders to be a little more ruthless, to be more of that kind of fighter, that Republicans have had that kind of political instinct for a while.
That's interesting. That's something I've been hearing a lot in the last couple of days. Just speaking to voters about this. Their perception was that this is the first time that the party's fighting fire with fire, whereas in the past, their perception was that if the Republicans go low, the Democrats try to go high, and it didn't necessarily work. And this is kind of a really tangible example of senior Democrats taking a more aggressive, assertive approach towards an issue that I think a lot of Democratic voters think was missing throughout the election of last year and the first 8 months of Trump so far.
So I guess the question is also going to be, who's the fighter? I was just jotting down some names before we came on with each other. There are the popular governors out there, Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania, Wes Moore of Maryland, J.B. Pritzker, who's hosting those Democrats from Texas, of Illinois, Gavin Newsom, California, Andy Beshear, Kentucky. But then you also have these up-and-comers. James Tallarico is one of these Texas Democrats who's gotten a lot of attention because he went on the Joe Rogan podcast. And at the end of this long conversation that Joe Rogan has, and remember, Joe Rogan was one of the instrumental figures in the media space that was able to in a way, help influence some of those young male voters in favor of Donald Trump. Donald Trump came on his podcast and had a long conversation with Joe Rogan. But Joe Rogan, at the end of this podcast with James Tallarico, this young Democrat from Texas, said, "Oh, you should run for president." And that really got a lot of attention. So I'm wondering who you guys see as at this point, very early on, and we're still talking about 2026 midterms, let alone 2028, but as the next possible leaders of the party.
It's interesting to see kind of people starting to play a little bit in their lanes and start to also test the waters a little bit. I was thinking today, Ruben Gallego, who's a senator from Arizona, is on
Yeah.
his way to Iowa today. Now, for Democrats, Iowa doesn't play as big of a role anymore because of the way they reorganized their party primary structure. But still, the idea that he's going to a red state that Trump won overwhelmingly twice to try to kind of see what the appetite is or test his messaging there, I think is really telling. I'm going to be very interested to see who plays well in the midterms. So is Josh Shapiro out there campaigning for Democrats and campaigning successfully for them? Who wants to be seen with a particular Democrat? Do you want to be seen with Shapiro? Do you want to be seen with Kamala Harris? That's going to be a big question I have. Do you want to be seen with Gavin Newsom? Who are the party players are going to be kind of able to exert some kind of influence through the midterms as they are out there campaigning and testing the waters for potential runs and kind of seeing what the appetite among the Democratic Party is right now.
And we should say Ruben Gallego, who you were mentioning, Caitlin, a senator from Arizona, is a Latino man. And after an election where we saw Latino men moving towards the Republicans and moving towards Donald Trump, he's seen as a more centrist candidate who can perhaps appeal to some of those voters, maybe bring them back to the Democratic Party. And then you have, voices like Pete Buttigieg, formerly a presidential candidate and the Secretary of Transportation, who is still obviously one of the voices that many Democrats look to as a more centrist voice. But just, to your point, to both of your points, really, it's going to be a question of not only, who do they want to appeal to, but how are they seen by voters on a broader base, not just Democrat voters, but also Republican voters. And that's going to be a really difficult line for any of these figures to walk. And that's why, often governors have it a bit easier, don't they? They are the executive in their state. Their constituents are both Democrats and Republicans. And you can look at somebody like Andy Beshear, who has won Kentucky. Will he do well on a national scale? Will he do well with Black voters in South Carolina? That all remains to be seen. But the fact that he can appeal on a broader scale, Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania as well, to both Republicans and Democrats could be something that will be telling in terms of how Democrats look towards their next phase.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially to your point about governors, I mean, they have to work across the aisle oftentimes if they have a divided legislature or a legislature stacked against their party. And I think what, and you mentioned the, going on different podcasts and such. I think one of the big takeaways from the 2024 election was that voters do place some premium on authenticity. And so it's not just that you can go on a podcast, it's that you can, be a human being and talk to voters where they are and about things they care about and talk like a regular human being. And I think that's what Democrats are trying to figure out too, kind of where to go, what avenues to use, what media avenues to use, and, how to be, replicate a situation where they are kind of just talking to people about what they care about. And I think that will be really interesting to see. So it's, one thing to be able to go on a podcast, but another thing to be able to kind of be yourself and relate to people in a way that's at least gets them to listen to what you're saying.
We certainly will be talking about the Democrats and their prospects for many more episodes to come. But Caitlin, it has been so lovely to have you. Thank you very much for joining us on our podcast today. It's been great to hear your insights. And obviously, we're neighbors, CBS and BBC, and yes, partners here in the U.S. So there'll be much more of this exchange, I'm sure, going forward.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It was great to talk to you both.
All right.
Thanks
see
so
you guys.
much for coming on. Bye.
If you've enjoyed this episode of The President's Path, then like or subscribe to our YouTube channel. We'd love to hear from you. So please leave us a comment below or email us on path@bbc.co.uk.